Everyone's heard of Katyusha. Most people have seen the old footage. The rockets going up in those long streaking arcs, the smoke trails cutting across a gray wartime sky, the sound like nothing else in the war. A howl, a scream, something between a machine and something alive. But almost nobody actually knows what Katyusha did at Stalingrad. Not really. They know the name. They know the mythology. They've seen it listed in documentaries as one of World War II's iconic weapons. But the actual story, the numbers, the tactics, the desperate improvisation, the sheer scale of destruction that this system unleashed inside one city during one of the most brutal battles in human history, that story almost never gets told in full. And if you want to understand why this weapon matters, you have to start by throwing out everything you think you know about how a rocket launcher is supposed to work. Because Katyusha wasn't elegant, it wasn't precise, it wasn't even particularly advanced by the engineering standards of its time. Soviet engineers who worked on competing systems sometimes called it crude. German officers who encountered it in the field called it terrifying, and the soldiers who operated it called it something that doesn't translate cleanly, but roughly means little sister. A weapon so loud, so violent, and so psychologically devastating that it left grown men shaking in their foxholes for hours after the last rocket landed. If you've never gone deep on this weapon before, stay with this. Because what happened at Stalingrad between 1942 and 1943 changed the way militaries around the world thought about rocket artillery forever, and it started with a system that military planners in other countries had largely written off as too primitive to matter. Subscribe if you haven't already. What we're about to cover goes way deeper than any standard documentary treatment. Now let's go back to the beginning and build this from the ground up. The idea of shooting rockets at an enemy is not a modern invention. It's not even a World War II invention. Rockets have been used in warfare for centuries, first in China, then in India, then in Europe. By the time Napoleon was marching across the continent, the British military was already experimenting with Congreve rockets, large, unguided projectiles designed to set fire to enemy formations and terrify their horses. They were inaccurate to a degree that would make a modern artilleryman laugh. You pointed them roughly in the right direction and hoped, but the psychological effect was real. Fire falling from the sky in unexpected places tends to disrupt people's plans. By the early 20th century, the military value of unguided rockets had been largely set aside. Conventional artillery had become so sophisticated, so accurate, so powerful, that the crude rocket seemed obsolete by comparison. A howitzer shell could be calculated to land within meters of a target. A rocket in those early years could land almost anywhere in a wide radius. For precision fire, rockets were useless, and so the world moved on. But the Soviet Union didn't entirely move on. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet military scientists, working in a research group that would eventually become part of the famous Jet Propulsion Research Institute, began looking at rockets not as replacement artillery, but as a different kind of weapon entirely. They weren't trying to hit a specific gun emplacement or a particular building. They were thinking about area saturation, about what happens when you don't need precision because you're firing so many projectiles at once that precision becomes irrelevant. The key figure in the early development was Boris Petropavlovsky, who led rocket research projects in the late 1920s. After his death, the work continued under a rotating cast of engineers, including Georgy Langemak, Valentin Glushko, and Sergei Korolev, who would later become the chief architect of the Soviet space program. The system they were developing used solid propellant rockets, which were more stable and easier to manufacture than liquid propellant alternatives. The rocket itself, eventually designated the RS-132, was a finned projectile about 1.8 meters long, packed with an explosive warhead and propelled by a stick of solid nitrocellulose propellant that burned hot and fast. The launcher they designed to carry multiple rockets could be mounted on the back of a truck. You could drive it to a position, angle the rails, fire a full salvo in seconds, and drive away before the enemy had time to respond with counter-battery fire. In a war where motor vehicles were increasingly the backbone of military logistics, this mobility was not a minor feature. It was everything. Soviet military brass were cautious at first. There were powerful constituencies within the Red Army that favored conventional artillery and looked skeptically at rockets as a serious weapon of war. The developmental path was not smooth. Some of the engineers involved faced political persecution during Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Langemak was arrested and executed in 1938, a victim of the paranoid machinery of the Soviet state. Korolev was sent to a labor camp. The program stumbled, but it did not die. By 1938 and 1939, field testing of the BM-13 system, which used the evolved M-13 rocket on a multi-rail launch frame mounted on a truck chassis, was producing results that were hard to ignore. A single vehicle could carry 16 rockets on its launch rails. A battery of vehicles could fire simultaneously, saturating an area with dozens of explosive warheads in under 10 seconds. The psychological effect on anyone inside that area was, by all test accounts, extreme. Soviet military observers noted that test animals placed within the target zone showed signs of severe trauma, even when the explosions weren't close enough to cause direct physical injury. Something about the sound, the concussive wave, the unpredictable impact pattern produced a specific kind of terror that conventional artillery bombardment did not replicate in the same way. The formal military designation of the weapon was BM-13, with BM standing for Boyovaya Mashina, which translates roughly as combat vehicle. But the soldiers who used it, and eventually the entire Soviet war machine, called it Katyusha. The exact origin of that nickname is debated. Some say it came from the Katyusha brand mark stamped on one of the factory components. Others trace it to a popular Soviet wartime song called Katyusha, about a young woman waiting for her soldier to come home. The song became enormously popular after 1938, and there's something almost poetic about linking this screaming rocket weapon to a song about longing and waiting. The Germans, who had a different emotional relationship with the incoming fire, called it something else entirely. Stalinorgel, Stalin's organ, a reference to the multiple launch tubes which, if you squint and accept a very loose metaphor, look vaguely like the pipes of an organ. And the sound it made, they said, sounded like music from hell. The BM-13 made its operational combat debut on July 14, 1941, just 3 weeks after Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and began the most destructive land invasion in history. The circumstances were desperate. The German advance was moving so fast it was outrunning its own supply lines. The Red Army was in a state of catastrophic disintegration, losing hundreds of thousands of men, entire armies encircled and destroyed within weeks. The first operational use of Katyusha was commanded by Captain Ivan Flyarov, who led a battery of 7 BM-13 launchers in an attack on the railway junction at Orsha in what is now Belarus. Flyarov's battery fired a full salvo directly into the rail yards where German supply trains were concentrated. The effect was devastating. Rail cars loaded with ammunition and fuel exploded in chain reactions. German forces in the area reported mass confusion, fires they couldn't control, and a sound they had never heard before and had no idea how to categorize. Flyarov's battery was subsequently surrounded and destroyed in the encirclements that followed. Flyarov himself was killed, reportedly detonating the launchers himself to prevent capture. He was posthumously named a hero of the Russian Federation decades later. But that first strike sent a message through Soviet military channels that reverberated all the way to the top. This weapon worked. Now they needed thousands of them. Soviet industrial capacity in the early years of the war was in chaos. German forces had overrun huge swaths of the industrial heartland. Factories were being physically dismantled and moved east of the Ural Mountains to put them out of reach of the Wehrmacht. Workers were moving machinery in winter conditions, setting up new production lines in fields, in half-constructed buildings, in conditions that defy modern comprehension. And yet the production of Katyusha systems expanded continuously throughout 1941 and into 1942. By mid-1942, the Red Army had formed dedicated Guards mortar units equipped exclusively with rocket artillery. The designation Guards was itself significant. In Soviet military nomenclature, Guards units were elite formations that had distinguished themselves in combat. Attaching that designation to Katyusha units from the beginning was a deliberate political and psychological statement. These weapons were not auxiliary support. They were central to the Soviet way of war. Now we need to talk about what Stalingrad actually was. Because the battle has become so mythologized, so wrapped in symbol and narrative, that it's easy to forget the physical reality of what fighting there meant. Stalingrad in 1942 was a major Soviet industrial city stretched along the western bank of the Volga River. It extended for roughly 50 kilometers along the riverfront, but it was relatively narrow in depth, sometimes only a few kilometers between the river and the German line. The city had factories, most significantly, the tractor factory, the Barakati gun factory, and the Krasny Oktyabr steel plant. It had residential blocks, workers' housing, schools, railway lines, storage depots, parks, and a central hill called Mamayev Kurgan, that provided observation over virtually the entire city. By late September 1942, German forces under General Friedrich Paulus had pushed Soviet defenders back to slivers of territory along the riverbank. There were moments when the Soviet hold on the West Bank was measured in meters rather than kilometers. Supply convoys crossing the Volga under constant German fire became the lifeline, without which the defense would have collapsed within days. The fighting inside Stalingrad was unlike almost anything that had come before in the war. It was urban combat in its most extreme form. Buildings became fortresses, stairwells became killing grounds, sewers were used as movement corridors, snipers operated from ruined walls at ranges of 50 meters. A single factory floor might change hands 4 or 5 times in a single day, and the morning would find both German and Soviet soldiers sleeping in the same ruined space, exhausted, unable to push further in the dark. The tactical situation was so compressed, so close, that normal artillery support became nearly impossible. If Soviet guns on the east bank of the Volga fired in support of troops fighting inside the tractor factory, the margin between hitting Germans and hitting their own men was sometimes only 20 or 30 meters. Heavy artillery, which needs space and standoff distance to be effective, was to a significant degree neutralized by the closeness of the fighting. This is the environment into which Katyusha was introduced at scale, and this is where the story gets genuinely remarkable, because on paper, a weapon known for inaccuracy should have been even less useful in close urban combat than conventional artillery. The logic seemed clear. If precise guns were dangerous in these conditions, unguided rockets should have been catastrophic, and in some circumstances they were. There are documented instances of rocket salvos landing among Soviet positions due to calculation errors, mechanical failures, or the simple chaos of a battlefield where positions changed faster than maps could be updated. War is not a controlled environment, and Katyusha was not a precision weapon. But the Soviet commanders at Stalingrad developed something that made the weapon work in ways that surprised everyone, including themselves. They figured out how to use the weapon's limitations as a feature rather than a flaw. The key insight was this: you don't use Katyusha to hit a specific position. You use it to make a specific area impossible to be in. In open field warfare, that distinction doesn't matter much, because the enemy can simply retreat from the impact zone and regroup. But in Stalingrad, retreat was not always an option. German forces operating inside the city were themselves constrained by the urban terrain. A company pushing through a factory had walls on both sides, rubble ahead, and a specific corridor of advance. They couldn't simply sidestep a rocket barrage. And so Soviet commanders began using Katyusha batteries positioned on the eastern bank of the Volga to drop rocket salvos into specific grid squares of the city, areas they knew German forces were concentrated, areas where the terrain meant those forces had limited ability to disperse. The M13 rocket had a warhead containing approximately 4.9 kilograms of explosive. It was not a bunker buster. It could not penetrate reinforced concrete or heavy armor directly, but the area effect of a full battery salvo, 16 rockets per launcher, 4 to 6 launchers firing simultaneously, was tremendous. A single firing event could place 60 to 96 rockets into a target area within seconds. The blast overpressure from that many simultaneous detonations in close proximity was capable of collapsing weakened structures, killing infantry in the open, disabling vehicles not protected by heavy armor, destroying communications equipment, and producing a level of acoustic and physical shock that temporarily incapacitated even soldiers who were physically uninjured. But it was the effect on armor that became Katyusha's most significant contribution at Stalingrad. And this requires some careful explanation, because it involves understanding how tanks actually become vulnerable in urban combat, which is very different from how they're vulnerable in the open field. A tank in an open field has a relatively small chance of being hit by unguided rockets in a salvo because it can move freely, it presents a small target relative to the surrounding terrain, and its crew has visibility to detect incoming fire and take evasive action. Rockets that miss a tank in the open field simply detonate in empty ground and cause limited secondary effect. A tank in Stalingrad was a completely different problem. In the city, tanks moved through rubble-choked streets, often in single file, sometimes unable to traverse their turrets fully because of the enclosing walls. They were frequently separated from their infantry support, which the brutal close-quarters fighting had stripped away. Their crews had limited visibility because opening hatches meant exposure to sniper fire, and the complex urban terrain blocked line of sight from inside the vehicle. A tank that stopped moving in a Stalingrad street because its path was blocked by rubble or because infantry support had been separated was vulnerable in a way that tanks in open warfare almost never experienced. And Katyusha rockets, landing in those confined streets, didn't need to score a direct hit on a tank to kill it. A rocket detonating within a few meters of a vehicle in a confined street channeled its blast wave in ways that open-field detonations did not. Walls and rubble concentrate, explosive energy rather than letting it dissipate in all directions. The antenna systems on tanks, the vision blocks, the external fuel tanks on some German models, the track systems, the running gear, all of these external components were vulnerable to near-miss blast and fragment effects that would cause immobilization even if the main armor was untouched. An immobilized tank in a Stalingrad street was effectively dead because there was no space to recover it under fire, and the infantry needed to hold the area while it was repaired, were the same infantry being killed by the same bombardment. Beyond mechanical damage, Soviet tacticians noticed something else. The psychological effect of Katyusha fire on German armor crews was severe in ways that went beyond what the physical damage statistics suggested. Tank crews who survived salvos uninjured were frequently reported by German unit records to have shown signs of acute combat stress, meaning they fought less effectively, made worse decisions, and in some cases refused to advance into areas where Katyusha fire had recently fallen. This was not cowardice. This was the rational response of human nervous systems to an extreme and unusual stimulus. The sound of incoming Katyusha rockets, a shrieking, wailing howl, unlike anything conventional artillery produced, combined with the sudden and apparently random distribution of impacts, created a specific psychological profile that military psychiatrists of the era didn't yet have language for, but that later generations would recognize as hallmarks of acute stress reaction. German after-action reports from Stalingrad repeatedly mention Katyusha as a primary cause of tank crew casualties and tank losses across the battle. Post-war analysis of German armor strength in the Sixth Army before and during the encirclement shows a pattern of attrition that cannot be explained purely by direct anti-tank fire. Many vehicles were lost to what German records describe as artillery action, and within that category, Guards mortar units, the Soviet designation for Katyusha batteries, account for a striking portion of the damage reports. The specific numbers are difficult to pin down with absolute precision because the records of the battle are incomplete, distributed across Russian, German, and international archives, and many documents were destroyed in the closing phases of the fighting when the Sixth Army was disintegrating. But the estimates that military historians have produced through careful cross-referencing of available sources are genuinely striking. Some analyses suggest that Katyusha fire was responsible for the destruction or disabling of more German armored vehicles during the Stalingrad campaign than any other single weapon system. More than anti-tank guns, more than aircraft, more than mines, the weapon that military doctrine suggested was too inaccurate for serious tactical use had become the single most effective tank-killing system in the most important battle of the Eastern Front. How is that possible? How does a rocket that can't reliably hit a specific target kill more tanks than weapons specifically designed for that purpose? The answer lies in scale, in environment, and in how you define killing a tank. An anti-tank gun kills a tank by destroying it in a single action. A hit from a Pak-40, the standard German anti-tank gun, penetrates armor and kills the crew, or ignites the fuel or ammunition. That's a destroyed tank. But military effectiveness isn't only about destroyed tanks. It's about tanks that can't advance, tanks whose crews are incapacitated by fear, tanks that are immobilized even temporarily at critical moments, tanks that are abandoned when their crews decide the situation is unsurvivable. Katyusha caused all of these outcomes in large numbers, and it caused them consistently across a battle that lasted for months. It's also important to understand the operational tempo of Katyusha use at Stalingrad. This wasn't a weapon that fired occasionally in support of specific operations. Soviet Guards mortar units were firing around the clock during the most intense phases of the battle. The logistical apparatus to supply those units with rockets was a significant part of the overall supply effort across the Volga. Barges and boats crossing the river at night, under German fire, were carrying not only food and ammunition for the rifle units, but rockets, fuses, and propellant for the artillery pieces. The priority given to that supply chain tells you something about how Soviet commanders assessed the weapon's value. When you're fighting for your life across a river in a city that's being destroyed around you, and you're still making sure the rocket launcher units get their ammunition, that weapon has become something close to essential. The sound. We keep coming back to the sound because the soldiers who were there keep coming back to the sound. Veterans of Stalingrad on both sides, interviewed for decades after the war, consistently described the sound of Katyusha fire as something that left a permanent mark on them. Soviet veterans described pride, a rush of relief when they heard those rockets going over their heads toward German positions, knowing that something was being done, that the situation wasn't simply being endured, but actively contested. German veterans described something closer to dread, a specific form of anticipatory anxiety that developed after the first time they experienced a salvo and that never entirely went away. Former members of German infantry and armor units who survived the battle consistently ranked Katyusha among the 2 or 3 most frightening combat experiences of the entire war, which is a remarkable statement given what those men went through. There's testimony from a German panzer officer, recorded years after the war, in which he describes being inside a tank during a Katyusha bombardment in the factory district of Stalingrad. He says the rockets hit in so many different places at once that it was impossible to identify where to move to get clear of the fire zone. The noise inside the tank, amplified by the metal hull, was so intense that communication with the crew became impossible. When the barrage stopped, he found that 2 members of his crew were physically unharmed, but functionally incapacitated, unable to respond to orders, staring at nothing, bodies rigid. He had to physically move them before they could function again. The tank was undamaged. The rocket barrage had killed no one, but the vehicle had been taken out of the battle as effectively as if it had been penetrated by an anti-tank round. This is the dimension of Katyusha's effectiveness that doesn't appear in the kill statistics. It appears in the German infantry progress reports, in the records of positions that weren't taken, in the accounts of attacks that began, absorbed rocket fire, and then simply stopped. Every time a German advance was halted not by physical destruction, but by the psychological collapse produced by Katyusha fire, that was combat effectiveness. That was the weapon doing its job. Now let's talk about how Soviet commanders actually deployed these systems within the Stalingrad context. Because the tactics evolved significantly from the early days of the war to the sophisticated employment seen in late 1942 and early 1943. Early in the war, Katyusha batteries had been used in large, concentrated salvos from well behind the front line, often in direct support of conventional artillery barrages. The approach was relatively simple. Pick a target area, calculate the firing data, fire the salvo, and relocate before German counter-battery radar could locate you. The shoot-and-scoot doctrine was fundamental to Katyusha's survival. A battery that stayed in position after firing was a battery that invited destruction. German artillery was extremely capable, and if they could get a location fix on Katyusha launch positions, they would respond with precision counter-battery fire that could destroy the relatively unprotected launchers and their trucks. At Stalingrad, the Volga River created a natural defensive advantage for Soviet rocket artillery. The eastern bank of the river was beyond the reach of most German direct-fire weapons. German artillery on the western bank could fire across, but the depths involved made precise counter-battery work much more difficult, and Soviet rocket batteries positioned on the eastern bank could fire into the city without being in immediate danger from the close-range German fire that was devastating infantry on the western bank. This geographic reality allowed Soviet commanders to position Katyusha batteries with somewhat more permanence and concentration than had been possible in more fluid phases of the fighting. But the real tactical evolution at Stalingrad was in how the batteries were cued and what they were asked to hit. Soviet commanders developed a system of forward observers who were embedded with the rifle units fighting inside the city. These observers, often operating at extreme personal risk in the rubble and ruins of the factory district and residential areas, carried radio equipment and maintained communication with the artillery coordination centers on the eastern bank. When a German armored or infantry push developed, the observer would radio a grid reference and a description of the situation. The artillery coordination center would calculate which available batteries had the range and angle, assign priority to Katyusha units based on the nature of the target, and order the salvo. The coordination was not perfect. Nothing at Stalingrad was perfect. Radio equipment was unreliable. Observers were killed with regularity. The grid maps used by both sides were sometimes inconsistent or outdated, as the terrain was physically transformed by weeks of bombardment. But the system improved continuously throughout the battle. By the time Soviet forces were preparing the counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, in November 1942, the coordination between forward observers, conventional artillery, and Katyusha units had reached a level of sophistication that represented a genuine leap forward in Red Army tactical capability. Operation Uranus itself, launched November 19, 1942, was the operation that encircled the German Sixth Army and turned Stalingrad from a German offensive into a German catastrophe. And Katyusha played a central role in the opening bombardment that preceded the armored breakthrough. Soviet gunners had massed an extraordinary concentration of artillery along the attack sectors north and south of Stalingrad. The plan called for a preparatory bombardment of roughly 80 minutes duration before the armor moved. Katyusha units were integrated into this bombardment in specific ways. Where conventional artillery was tasked with destroying known strongpoints, bunkers, artillery positions, and command facilities, Katyusha batteries were concentrated against troop assembly areas, vehicle parks, and the lines of communication behind the German and Romanian defensive positions. The objective was not to destroy specific targets, but to prevent organized response, to suppress the movement of reserves, to saturate the areas where the defenders would try to regroup or reinforce if the front line was penetrated. In the operational phase, preventing organized response is often more valuable than destroying physical assets. A reserve that can't reach the front because the routes are under rocket fire is as ineffective as a reserve that has been destroyed. And Katyusha was an extraordinarily efficient tool for denying ground to movement, even when it wasn't specifically killing individual soldiers or vehicles. The results of Operation Uranus spoke for themselves. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, which formed the flanks of the German position, collapsed under the combined pressure of the armored breakthrough and the accompanying artillery preparation. Within 4 days, the encirclement was complete. The German 6th Army, approximately 300,000 men, was trapped inside the Stalingrad pocket with no realistic prospect of supply or breakout. The Katyusha batteries, that had helped suppress the flanks during the breakthrough assault, now turned their fire on the perimeter of the pocket, contributing to the slow, grinding reduction of German resistance over the following weeks. The fighting inside the pocket during November, December, and January of 1942 and 1943 was among the most brutal of the entire war. German soldiers starved. Aircraft attempting to supply the pocket by air were shot down in large numbers. Winter temperatures fell to 40 degrees below zero. Soviet forces tightened the encirclement methodically, using Katyusha fire to precede every infantry and armored thrust into the shrinking German perimeter. By the time Field Marshal Paulus surrendered on February 2, 1943, the Sixth Army had lost effectively all of its armored strength to the combination of combat damage, fuel starvation, and the constant attrition of Soviet artillery. The end at Stalingrad confirmed what the Soviet military had been discovering throughout the battle. The Katyusha system had fundamentally changed the character of Soviet offensive and defensive fire support. It wasn't replacing conventional artillery. It was doing something conventional artillery couldn't do, providing massive, rapid, area-wide fire at a tempo that kept enemy forces continuously suppressed without requiring the logistical overhead of conventional tube artillery at comparable densities. To understand why that mattered, you have to think about the physics of conventional artillery. A howitzer is a precision instrument. It requires careful laying, meticulous ammunition preparation, and skilled crews. Each round costs significant time and labor to produce. The gun itself requires maintenance, wears out its barrel after a specific number of rounds, and must be positioned carefully to avoid counter-battery fire. In a high-intensity battle, the rate of fire that a conventional artillery unit can sustain is limited by these factors. To cover a large area quickly, you need many guns, many crews, and enormous quantities of ammunition. A Katyusha battery can fire 16 rockets in under 10 seconds. 16 rounds from a conventional howitzer battery takes roughly 5 to 10 minutes depending on the pace. The salvo effect, all 16 rockets arriving within a few seconds of each other, creates a fundamentally different target effect than 16 rounds spread over 10 minutes. The concentration of energy in a very short time window is itself a multiplier of effect. And then the battery moves. The total time from begin firing to vehicle departure from the firing position could be as little as 2 minutes. Counter-battery fire directed at the firing position arrives to find nothing there. The Soviet military recognized this and structured their guards mortar units accordingly. Batteries were organized into regiments, and regiments were assigned to army-level command rather than being distributed among individual divisions. This centralization allowed the senior commander to mass rocket fire on the most critical sectors rather than having the batteries parceled out and used in penny packets across a wide front. When the Soviets needed to break a German position at Stalingrad, they could concentrate multiple Katyusha regiments on a single sector, producing a density of fire that was simply unachievable with conventional artillery in the available time. There's a document in the Russian military archives, portions of which have been published by historians studying the battle, that records the expenditure of Katyusha rockets during specific phases of Operation Uranus. The numbers are genuinely staggering. In the opening days of the counteroffensive alone, Soviet Katyusha units fired tens of thousands of rockets across the breakthrough sectors. For a weapon that had been in formal service for barely 18 months, the scale of production and logistical delivery that those numbers represent is remarkable and speaks to the priority the Soviet war economy placed on the system. The Germans tried to capture Katyusha equipment to understand how it worked. Intact launchers were a priority intelligence target. There are records of German units receiving specific orders to attempt to seize complete BM-13 systems for technical examination. Soviet crews were under equally specific orders to destroy their equipment before allowing capture, following the precedent set by Captain Flyarov in 1941. In most cases, Soviet crews complied. There were instances of captured equipment, and German engineers did examine the rockets carefully, but they never found the performance gap they expected to find. The rockets were solid propellant, relatively simple in construction, and not obviously superior to what German engineers could have produced. The German conclusion, documented in several technical reports, was that the Katyusha's effectiveness came not from any exotic technological advantage, but from Soviet willingness to produce and employ it in quantities that the German military calculus had not anticipated. That is a deeply important conclusion. It means the weapon's power was organizational and doctrinal as much as it was technical. The Soviets had figured out how to make quantity itself into quality. This brings us to something that deserves more attention than it usually gets. The people who built and fired these rockets. The soldiers in the Guards mortar units were not anonymous cogs in a machine. They were men, and in some cases women, who operated under extreme conditions, who drove their vehicles across terrain that would test a modern four-wheel drive to its limits, who set up firing positions under fire, who made calculations with slide rules and paper tables, and then trusted those calculations with other people's lives, and who lived with the knowledge that their bright, screaming rockets made them one of the most recognizable and targeted elements of the battlefield. Soviet artillery units at Stalingrad suffered enormous casualties. The forward observer teams who directed the fire from positions inside the city had some of the highest casualty rates of any specialist role in the battle. A forward observer who survived 2 weeks of continuous duty in the factory district was considered fortunate. The radio operators and runners who maintained communication between observers and the coordination centers on the East Bank were picked off by snipers, killed by shell fragments, and buried under rubble in numbers that are difficult to fully account for even now. The launch crews had their own particular dangers. The BM-13's launch rails were not protected by armor. The trucks were standard military vehicles. A battery parked in a firing position was vulnerable to aircraft, to counter battery fire, and to the occasional catastrophic malfunction of the rockets themselves. Defective propellant charges were a persistent quality control problem in the early production runs. A rocket that ignited improperly could explode on the rail rather than launching cleanly. Crews learned to inspect every rocket before loading, checking the propellant charge, the fusing, the fins, the electrical connectors. That pre-launch inspection became a ritual, a superstitious but practically necessary ceremony before every firing mission. The women who served in various roles in Soviet artillery at Stalingrad deserve specific acknowledgement. The Soviet military was more willing than almost any other major power to employ women in combat-adjacent roles, and in some cases in direct combat roles. Women served as forward observers, as radio operators, as drivers for the rocket launcher trucks, and in some documented cases as crew members on the launch vehicles themselves. The historical record on this has become clearer as Russian archives have been more systematically studied. And what it shows is a level of integration of female personnel into frontline military units that was genuinely unprecedented in modern warfare. These women endured the same conditions, the same risks, and produced the same results as their male counterparts. There's a specific account that has been cited in several histories of the Stalingrad battle involving a Katyusha battery that continued to operate after its male officers were killed or incapacitated, with the remaining female radio operator and a female vehicle driver maintaining fire support coordination until reinforcements arrived. The account is remarkable not for the gender of those involved, but for the mundane professionalism it describes. People doing a difficult technical job under impossible conditions because the job needed doing and because the alternative was unthinkable. That's the human texture of what Katyusha at Stalingrad actually meant. Now let's address the comparison that the title of this piece makes, because it's a claim that requires substantiation. Did Katyusha really kill more tanks than any other weapon system at Stalingrad? The honest answer is that the evidentiary record is complicated, as all records of a battle of that scale and chaos will be. What we can say with confidence is this: the available data from both Soviet and German records, cross-referenced by independent military historians since the Cold War ended and Russian archives became more accessible, supports the conclusion that rocket artillery caused a disproportionate share of German armored vehicle losses and disablements at Stalingrad relative to other weapon systems. The comparison to purpose-built anti-tank weapons is particularly striking. The Soviet anti-tank rifle, the PTRD and PTRs, were effective against lighter vehicles, but largely ineffective against the frontal armor of medium German tanks. Anti-tank guns, primarily the 45mm Soviet gun and captured German pieces, scored kills against armor, but required stable positions and direct fire lines that were frequently unavailable in the urban environment. Aircraft, despite their obvious capability against armor, were constrained by weather, ammunition, available airframes, and the need to distinguish Soviet from German positions in a city where the two were sometimes meters apart. Katyusha operated at night, in fog, through rain and snow. It didn't require line of sight. It could be directed at grid coordinates without the observer needing to be in a position that exposed them directly to the vehicles being targeted. In winter conditions that grounded aircraft and reduced visibility for direct-fire weapons, Katyusha remained operational because it was fundamentally a trajectory-based weapon, calculated from maps and tables, not from what the crew could see out their window. The operational analysis done by Soviet military planners after the battle, portions of which were published in Soviet military journals in the late 1940s and more fully in the 1950s and 1960s, explicitly credited rocket artillery with armored vehicle destruction statistics that exceeded those claimed by conventional artillery and anti-tank units. The methodology for arriving at those numbers is imperfect, because battlefield attribution of vehicle kills is always imperfect. A tank that is first hit by a rocket and then finished off by a Molotov cocktail might be credited to either weapon, depending on who is filling out the report. A tank that is abandoned by its crew after a rocket barrage but is physically intact might not appear in any kill statistics at all, even though the rocket fire is what removed it from the battle. When you include all the categories, destroyed, disabled, crew incapacitated, and abandoned, the case for Katyusha as the single most effective weapon against German armor at Stalingrad becomes very strong. No other system combined the area effect, the psychological impact, the all-weather capability, and the ability to kill armor without a direct hit that made Katyusha so effective in that specific urban and operational context. It's also worth noting that this assessment was shared by the German military itself. Post-war interrogations of senior German officers captured at Stalingrad repeatedly identified Soviet rocket artillery as the weapon they most feared and the one that they felt least equipped to counter. General Hans Dörr, who wrote an important early German account of the battle, specifically identified the mass use of rocket artillery as a Soviet advantage that the Wehrmacht had no equivalent response to. German rocket artillery existed. The Nebelwerfer series of weapons was capable and respected, but it was not employed with the density, the centralization, or the doctrinal sophistication that the Soviets brought to the Katyusha program. The aftermath of Stalingrad accelerated the expansion of Soviet rocket artillery on a massive scale. By 1943 and 1944, Guards mortar units were present in every major Soviet operational grouping. New variants of the Katyusha system were introduced, including the BM-31, which fired the larger 300mm M31 rocket, and the BM-8, which used smaller 82mm rockets on denser rail arrays. The M13 continued as the standard system throughout the war, with production numbers that reached into the tens of thousands of rocket launchers and hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, of rockets before the war ended. The Lend-Lease program contributed to the Katyusha system in an indirect but essential way. American Studebaker trucks became the preferred vehicle for mounting the BM-13 launch rails. The US-6 Studebaker had better cross-country performance, greater reliability, and more payload capacity than most available Soviet trucks. Soviet Katyusha crews reportedly preferred the Studebaker over Soviet truck variants, so strongly that by mid-war, the Studebaker had become so associated with the weapon that some veterans referred to the whole system by the truck's name. The international origin of the delivery platform was irrelevant to the crews. What mattered was that it could carry the launcher, survive the roads, and move quickly after firing. The legacy of Katyusha extends far beyond World War II. The basic concept of multiple rocket launcher systems mounted on mobile platforms became a fundamental element of post-war military doctrine across the globe. The Soviet BM-21 Grad system, introduced in 1963, carried 40 122mm rockets and became one of the most widely proliferated weapons systems in the world, used on every continent in conflicts, from the Middle East to Africa to Southeast Asia. The Chinese Type 63, the American M270 MLRS, the Israeli LAR-160, all descend conceptually from the approach that Soviet engineers developed in the 1930s and Soviet commanders refined at Stalingrad. There is a Katyusha memorial at Mamayev Kurgan in Volgograd, the former Stalingrad. The hill itself, which changed hands multiple times during the battle, and which saw some of the most brutal fighting in a battle that was nothing but brutal fighting, now hosts one of the most remarkable war memorials in the world. The scale of what is commemorated there is almost impossible to process. More than 1 million people died in the Stalingrad campaign when all causes and all nationalities are included. The Soviet defenders of the city, the soldiers who crossed the Volga under fire, who fought for every floor of every factory, who called in Katyusha fire onto positions sometimes barely beyond their own perimeter, they held, against everything, against the most powerful army the European continent had produced in the 20th century. They held, and then they counterattacked, and what had been the greatest German advance in history became the hinge on which the entire war turned. The Katyusha was part of that. Not the only part,